Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. It's hard to imagine that anyone in the healthcare industry could have murder on his or her mind, but some do. The 19 cases in this book range across Europe, U.S., and Australia, documenting horrifying and sinister betrayals of trust. From Harold Shipman, Britain's most worst serial killer who murdered over 200 patients, to Roger Dean, the Sydney nurse who in 2011 set fire to the nursing home where he was working, killing 11 patients, these stories will make you wary and leave you shaking your head in horror. The book that we're featuring this evening is Angels of Death, Disturbing Real-Life Cases of Nurses and Doctors That Kill, with my special guest, journalist and author Emily Webb. Welcome back to the program, and thank you very, very much for agreeing to this interview, Emily Webb.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It's really exciting.
Well, thank you, and Angels of Death, some crazy stuff next time you're heading into a hospital or visiting somebody in the hospital. So this is really getting close to home, I think, in another... I talked with Charles Graeber. What's interesting about your book is that you talk about Charles Cullen, you call him Satan's son, and the last episode of December was Charles Graeber, and he wrote a book called The Good Nurse about Charles Cullen, and very, very interesting variant of the serial killer that we all have come to know. Again, it's a customary question, but of all the kinds of stories that you could handle in true crime, why did you want to do a book about these types of killers in Angels of Death?
Well, it's funny. It wasn't something that I consciously set out to do, but when I first met with the publisher who has since published these books, I had an idea. They asked me for some ideas, and I lived in the UK for quite a number of years, and I'd always known about the serial killer Beverly Aylett, who was a children's nurse, and she is probably one of the most notorious women in England. She often features in the newspapers, and she had killed some children in the early 1990s when she was a nurse. They think that she had Munchausen's by proxy, but she's now in a secure psychiatric facility, one of England's hospitals for the criminally insane, I guess. And I was thinking of her case, and then I thought, well, why don't I investigate whether there's enough cases for a book? And I was actually quite surprised to see there really was a lot of cases of healthcare serial killing, I think the term is, doctors and nurses. I was thinking of nurses, and then I thought, well, I'll incorporate doctors and other related professionals as well.
Right, and you do have stories that spread from Europe, U.S., Australia, and the U.S., and you do start off with Charles Cullen, one of the more known killers, if that's the right term, like I said, was the subject of Charles Graeber's book, The Good Nurse. In your next story in this, and we're going to examine just a few of the stories, but as soon as you open up this book, it's just chock full of every single page, really condensed stories of this new type of horror. In the second story that you have, you talk about Roger Dean from Sydney. So in Australia, he was 35 years old, and his murder weapon is a little different, or one of his murder weapons a little different. And we're talking about in 2011 when he was finally noticed. So let's talk about Roger Dean from Sydney and the nursing home that he was working at.
Yeah, sure thing. That certainly is one of the more shocking cases of recent news in Australia. Roger Dean was a nurse, and so over in Australia, I'm not sure what it's like in Canada or North America, but there's two different types of nurses. You've got a registered nurse, so that requires a university degree now, and you've got an enrolled nurse, which a lot of enrolled nurses work at aged care homes, but Roger Dean was a registered nurse, so he could give out the, the more serious medications that have to be locked away. So he worked in a nursing home. He was actually studying to be a lawyer in his spare time, so he was looking to do a career change. But what Roger Dean did was he caused a fire that ended up completely ripping through this aged care home in a Sydney suburb, and a lot of people died. So whether or not he intended to do that, what happened was he ended up, a mass murderer.
Now, it's interesting, his background, too. He had worked 10 years in facilities. You say he worked about 10 years in facilities in New South Wales. He was originally born in Vietnam, and he moved to Australia, and then he was working at this nursing home. And then they have something called CCTV footage. So tell us what that is. I know it's video footage, but tell us what CCTV footage, because it's very crucial in at trial with Roger Dean.
Sure. So CCTV footage is basically the facility security cameras that pick up movements within the facility and around the facility. So the CCTV footage was really crucial because what happened was Roger Dean set the fire to distract from an investigation that was going to happen, had started to happen, about the theft of a certain type of drug, from opiate drugs, endone tablets, basically tablets that you, painkillers that are highly addictive. So he was addicted to those drugs. He was using those drugs and he was stealing them from the, locked cabinet in the nursing home. So it's obviously illegal. What happened was this had been detected, so at handover on the shift the day before the nursing home fire, it was mentioned at handover, which is where, the nurse on one particular shift hands over the notes to the next nurses to let them know what's happening. So it was mentioned that this was detected and that police were coming. So the police came that night and had started to ask questions, but they got diverted on a different matter. It was a family violence matter that was far more pressing at the time. So Roger Dean, he knew he was in trouble. He knew he was going to get found out. If he was found out, that means the end of his nursing career, but also he would not be able to become a lawyer. And there was CCTV footage of showing him over previous times going in and out of that, it was a locked room where you go to get the drugs. So that's where the CCTV comes in. So basically what happened is that he knew that he was going to get caught, and so he decided to light a fire to divert attention from that. So I guess in a terrible way to put it, but to take the heat off himself and put a bit more focus on maybe, well, why did this fire start? What's happened? And so maybe his crime would go unnoticed. But it ended up a lot worse than he intended.
Yes, certainly. He knew that the CCTV cameras were everywhere, but there wasn't a wing called the A2 wing, and there were a couple women, both named Dorothy, sleeping there, and another woman named Helen Perry. So tell us what Helen Perry said to Dean, and tell us about this whole, again, you bring us, the reader, right into this in terms of these two elderly women, immobile, you said, both of them, and another woman named Helen Perry, who was very conscious of what was going on. So tell us, with him knowing that the video cameras were not in the A2 wing, what did he do? And tell us about the two Dorothys and Helen Perry.
Well, there was no CCTV in this wing, so he knew that there was not going to be any detection. And these two ladies, the two Dorothys, were in their beds, they were asleep in their beds, and these women were immobile, so they weren't able to, get in and out of their rooms or out of their beds without assistance. He set a fire in an occupied bed of the room, and it's quite horrifying because knowing that these women were immobile, I mean, what else would he expect to happen than potentially killing them? So this fire triggered the fire alarm. So everything's it's hectic. Like what the footage that I've seen on the news at the time and the photos, it just shows a complete confusion. All these elderly people just looking so shocked, with breathing apparatuses on. And so Roger then pretended to try and, get these women out of the room. He heard their cries. A woman called Helen Perry had said to Roger Dean, I'm trying to get my, remember the whole story here. He stopped to help her out, to leave her room. So the two Dorothys were in their room. They may have been asleep. They may have been screaming for help. Then he heard this lady, Helen Perry, calling for help. And she also really wanted him to try and help save the two Dorothys. The fire had taken hold in that room, and there really was no chance that they would have been able to get out by themselves. And he had told this lady, Helen, not to worry. People were on their way to help them, and they, these women, were not able to be saved. So this lady, Mrs. Perry, Helen Perry, she survived, and she spoke to newspapers afterwards and had said that, the scene was like a war zone. There were people everywhere, and she was quite distressed that she tried to save her friends and they weren't able to be saved. And I think that went a long way to showing the intent behind Roger Dean's actions, even though he may not have intended to harm that many people. It was quite calculating in what he did.
Yeah, he sounds pretty guilty at this point. Never mind the rest of this story. Now, this is unbelievable story, really, and in that he tries 3 times to re-enter this burning building that he set aflame, and on the 3rd time he said he wanted to retrieve the drug record books. And so what happened? Unbelievably, the firefighters did what?
Well, they actually, I guess in the whole flurry of activity and the confusion, he was able to get into the room because the firefighters couldn't actually open the room themselves. They were having difficulty for whatever reason. And Dean was hanging around, persistently saying, look, I've got to get in there. I've got to get these books. We need them. Well, he needed them because they were incriminating to himself. So that's why he wanted to get them. Then they actually asked Roger Dean if he could help them, open the door. And he did, and then removed the drug log from the cabinet, and he put it in a satchel that he had. And I guess they'd wanted him to stay around because he was a staff member, but he actually lived quite nearby, and he kept saying to them, I'm an asthmatic, I need my Ventolin, I need to go home. Well, the reason he wanted to go home, according to the court documents, was that he wanted to destroy those drug books, get rid of them. And what happened was, at the time of the publicity about it, as he was leaving to go to his home, there were camera crews everywhere. It was a massive story. And a news reporter stopped him on his way. And, as journalists do, we ask people if they can give us, any idea of what's happening. We stop people, see if they've been involved. And he actually said to this reporter, I'm Roger, I'm one of the nurses, and there was a fire, and I just quickly did what I can, got everyone out, and the smoke is just overwhelming. But, we got a lot of people out, so that's the main thing. So for a while, he was portrayed as, someone who had helped. And that footage became quite disturbing later on as the real story unfolded.
Again, what's fascinating element to this story is that how they get this information, and if there was a loyalty, he was living with his ex-boyfriend, and so this man's name was Dean French. So he ran home trying to rip up these books and put them in a dumpster at the back of his ex-boyfriend's business, and that's how they knew about this. And apparently there was a video that showed that Well, there was also a video that showed Dean entering the rooms, so that was a timeline fit for the fires when we were talking about at the trial. And but tell us a little bit more how Dean French got involved, because apparently they weren't going to charge him. So how did it get to the point where he gave testimony against this person he was intimately involved with for a fair amount of time?
Just going to have to rewind my brain a bit to remember that, actually. What I do know, what I believe, I've got my book in front of me, and I'm just trying to remember what actually happened. Actually, you might need to refresh my memory. I'm sorry, Dan. I'm having a complete blank. I do believe, though, that he was involved in helping dispose of the books, and for his evidence on his ex-lover. They weren't together at the time. They were cohabiting, but not really in a committed relationship. I believe that the police were going to let him off, but you might have it more fresh in your memory because you've just read it.
No, that's what I was getting at, that he didn't just come forward, that there was some involvement there, so that's how he got to the point where he was actually testifying against his ex-lover here. With the interview, too, it was very interesting that at some point when he's interviewed, he starts talking about the reason why he set these fires. And so tell us about what you found in terms of his reasoning for these fires and who was to blame.
So I just had a bit of cross sound there, Dan. So can you just repeat that question?
I said basically that in an interview that it was interesting who he attributed or who he blamed for the fires themselves, and he spoke about who was to blame and a little bit about that. So tell us a little bit about who he blamed for these fires and how he spoke of his participation in those fires. Sure.
Well, the police found out fairly quickly on the day of the fire that he was responsible. So by that night, they were pretty sure they knew who it was, just for various reasons. And they had the CCTV footage, and also there were two other nurses on duty that night that said that Roger Dean had told them to both take their breaks at exactly the same time, which is not protocol. So Roger Dean would have been, I guess, the nurse in charge at that time, because he was a more, a registered nurse, and maybe the other nurses were enrolled nurses. So it would not be standard practice to say, both of you go on your break, but he did that so he could go and do what he did, which was light the fire. So he was arrested, and in the recorded interview with detectives, he seemed to be calm, and he seemed to give them pretty frank answers, but he actually told the police that he felt like Satan had possessed him and was telling him what to do. I'm not sure if the police believed him at that point or not, if they thought maybe that was a way he was trying to get them to think that he was mentally unwell. I mean, he was a drug addict. He was addicted to the opiates that he was stealing, but he said to them that he thought that Satan told him that it's the right thing to do, and he said to the police, I know you won't believe it, but that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Now, he was sentenced to life, no parole, but what was interesting is that you have in 2014 there's a coronial inquest into the fires, and they found that there was questionable work history, substance abuse, and his references were not checked. And he had really unnecessary access to drugs at that nursery home. Now, you include just in the same chapter a 1976 case in Chicago with Denise Watson, and she was charged with similar arson and murder of 23. She admitted to 69 counts, but she was a murder of 23. Tell us just a little bit about that and why you included that case of Denise Watson from Chicago.
Yeah, definitely. I literally stumbled across his case when I was researching, nursing home fires. And the thing I do love about writing and researching true crime is you just come across all these different things. And I included it because I thought it was interesting in terms of, other cases that related to people who, did these kind of crimes. But I was quite amazed with this case because, so Denise Denise was a 21-year-old nursing assistant and housekeeper, so I'm guessing she probably wasn't really doing too much nursing duties, more looking after people, maybe feeding them. And she worked in this nursing home in Chicago, and she started a fire that killed 23 people, and she admitted that she did it, that she dropped a match into a pile of clothes that was in a patient's, like a little locker, like a little cupboard that they have in the hospital. And at the time, you know, all the residents were frail, they weren't able to move around properly, and there were a number of residents who were in the nursing home chapel at the time celebrating Mass, and they were obviously, if you can imagine the scene and the fact that most deaths from fires come from smoke inhalation, it would have been absolute chaos. So these people were really struggling to evacuate, and most of the deaths from that nursing home fire came from shock and smoke inhalation. And also back in the 70s, there probably weren't as great health and safety measures. It didn't have a sprinkler system, so that was something that was highlighted after this incident. But what was interesting is once the police started to look into this incident, they found that this Denise Watson actually had a bit of a history of pyromania. In fact, one officer in a newspaper article I found said she had a bad history of pyromania, and she actually had been, one of the firemen who was involved as an arson investigator recognised her name, and he'd actually had dealings with her before. She had, there'd been a fire at the house where she lived in, which was declared arson by investigators. That was 3 years before, in 1973. And then in 1974, there were actually 3 small fires in her apartment that they believe were started by a nail polish remover. So she had a bit of a history of, you know, doing things. And actually, interestingly, the nursing home fire that she started in Chicago in 1976 is still the worst, one of the worst ever fires. It's actually documented in, if you look up history of Chicago, that will come up. And it was the most counts of murder that were ever charged to a single person, so the 69 counts of murder. And the reason why I wondered, well, why are there 69 counts of murder if there's 23 people who died? How they did it was apparently they made 3 different charges of murder for each individual death. I can't remember it on the top of my head why that was. So basically the investigators were sure that they, you know, had it in the bag. This was going to be an open and shut kind of case.
Sure.
However, obviously, and you know this from all your years of interviewing true crime authors and writing, things often come down to the way police interrogate someone, you know, the manner in which they do it. So even if someone is guilty, if a police officer doesn't interrogate properly or follow the processes, that case can be thrown out of court. And so basically her lawyer thought that he would, you know, his strategy was to discredit her confession. And he claimed that because she was so mentally, you know, she was mentally fragile, she was tired, he said that she would have been prepared to confess anything to get out of the interrogation room. And so basically the charges were thrown out based on that. They felt that she was pressured into her confession. So she was in court in 1977 in November, and it's quite interesting that the lawyer said that she's a nice girl and she was innocent of all the charges. So how could a nice girl do something like that? But basically she collapsed in court when she heard that the charges were thrown out of court. So I tried to find out more about what happened to her and whether or not she lit any more fires. I couldn't get that far, but she walked free. So I found that really intriguing and disturbing, and that's why I included it. And I as a reader, I like to have those kind of things in books. So now I'm writing true crime, I always like to infuse some of the cases with other cases that may be related, even if they're not from the same country.
What I found most fascinating about this, and you just touched on it, because we only have so many stories you can cram in a book, and you've done an admirable job putting 19 cases in this, was the public defender, really, she just had a public defender. She didn't have any special lawyer. And they were not very confident in her being able to beat this charge at all whatsoever, especially when he had her testify. So it's very interesting, and again, that's a whole other book, just having how on earth a juror how she could be effective testifying, how the jury could find her believable.
That's it. It makes you wonder how he portrayed her, because he knew that, well, she's going to get found guilty, but when he started to change his thinking and his strategy was when he found out that she had hours of interrogation by police. So that's, I guess, when he thought, well, let's try and discredit the confession. So, yeah, you wonder, I always find it interesting, when you see films or read about things where people are told how they should present themselves on the stand. For some reason, I'm thinking of the Anne Rule book, Small Sacrifices, with Diane Downs. I remember the Tully movie with Farrah Fawcett and how she was quite a hard-living, kind of woman, and on the stand, they get them to wear quite demure clothes and come across a certain way. I always find that really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, absolutely, because it's so rare when you do have a defendant take the stand. We had a case in this city where a guy who had been a former government official accused of murdering his wife with incredible amount of circumstantial evidence, certainly enough in an American, well, I'd say in American court you'd have a different outcome, but in Canada anyway, he had to take the stand, and he took the stand for 3 days or so, or 4 days, and withstood the cross-examination. But it was interesting when you heard snippets of how he was at court and how he conducted himself on the stand, and then how the jury interpreted that testimony, and he was acquitted. So very interesting when that very rare thing happens, when a defendant in a murder case takes a stand, because it's certainly not much of a strategy. It's usually a last-ditch effort. Now, another
definitely. It doesn't happen often.
No. And one of the more incredible cases, again, happens very early in your book. I mean, if you're really trying for a dramatic opening to a book, you really have it with these stories here of Catherine Wood and Gwen Graham in Grand Rapids, Michigan, going a little bit back in 1988. And these are two nurses' aides. And what you did, too, you included studies about serial killers, where just a little bit of statistics where you say women partners usually, if they're partners in crime, murder, usually target adults. And then they said if it was a lone killer, you said if it was a lone killer, they would target family members, typically with poison. Now, Wood and Graham are, defy categorization, and they met in 1986 in Walker, Michigan, outside of Grand Rapids. So tell us a little bit about Catherine Wood and Gwen Graham and their relationship. Tell us a little bit how that started and a little bit about their relationship.
Yeah, this case, when I read about this, this is one out of the box, really. It's definitely rare to have a female duo who kill in tandem, I guess, is what you call it, because usually it's a male. If a female's involved, it's going to be with a male. And often they say that the woman's dominated by the male. So in this case, these women were, they met through working at a nursing home, again. So a big theme in this book that I found with healthcare serial killers is obviously there's the hospital setting that provides their victims, but also the elderly are extremely vulnerable to these kind of killers. That's certainly the what came out of all the research I did. So these women, they paired up. They met at this nursing home, and it was actually described by some investigators as a hotbed of lesbian affairs at one point. So Catherine Wood had been married and had children. She had married young and had children young. They were only in their mid-20s, I think, when these offences happened. And Gwen Graham was also working at the nursing home, and she was, openly gay and was in a relationship with someone else. But they partnered up together and got romantically involved. Kathy had separated from her husband, and she'd been at home with her children, raising a family, and didn't really have a lot of skills because she'd left school early, so she got a job at this nursing home and worked her way up to, I guess, a position of some responsibility as a supervisor. So they got together, they made friends, just over the lunchroom, talking around the nursing home, and they hooked up together and they moved in together. It was quite a torrid romance, I guess. And, they were very, I don't know how do I put it? They definitely had a pretty intense relationship, I guess, sexually and emotionally, and it was quite volatile. So they got together, and there were a number of residents who died between a certain period of time in 1987. So between a period of time of January and April 1987, there had been a number of deaths at the home. But because these people were elderly, had Alzheimer's, often these deaths aren't really questioned. So I think, well, it's just old age. But Kathy had mentioned something to her ex-husband, whose name was Ken Wood, and he had gone to the police the year after that, in the October of 1988, and he said that his ex-wife Kathy had come to him and said she was living in fear of Gwen Graham, who was her lover at the time. They'd split up, but they were still in contact. So Kathy had told her husband that the pair of them had committed these murders soon after she split up. So their period of relationship wasn't that long. It was maybe 5 or 6 months. But during that time, they had teamed up together and they were killing people. Allegedly five people. And so Ken probably thought that his wife was telling outrageous tales. And he said to her, look, I won't tell anyone, because he didn't want the mother of his child to get, in trouble. Basically, it came out that the police, he went to the police because he thought, well, I really need to let them know. And then an investigation happened at this nursing home, which was called Alpine Manor, and it resulted in the arrest of Kathy and Gwen. But what happened then was that Kathy, to this day, I don't really know if Kathy or Gwen was the dominant or the passive person in the killings. There's a very comprehensive book that was written by an author called Lal Kofayel. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but he's a fairly well-known true crime author, and it was called Forever in 5 Days, and it was published in the 90s. It's the definitive account of that crime. But basically, Kathy ended up saying that she was pressured by Gwen to kill these women, and some of the methods were really quite horrifying when you think of it for elderly people who are infirm and can't fight back. They put face washes on their faces so they would suffocate and things like that. And it was, what came out of some of the investigation was that it was almost like a game to these women, and that they had intended, each victim was chosen based on the letter of their first name, and they wanted to spell out murder. That was never proven, but certainly it was quite a sensational claim.
Mm-hmm.
So they're both in jail, both of them.
It's interesting too just the motivation for Catherine to come forward to her ex and tell her about this information and say that she was in fear of Graham, and then talked about all the murders and talked again about taking their initials and spelling out the word murder. She also talked about that they had a thing, they would have a term, say, do them, in terms of who they were going to kill, and they had a trophy shelf. Again, this wasn't proven because they never found any of this, that she had said that they had jewelry and even false teeth that they were saving in on their trophy shelf, and that they had this, again, very, very adventurous sex life with bondage and autoasphyxiation and and holding a gun to their private parts. And so it was very, again, the media loved this, didn't they, in terms of taking all these stories.
Yeah, it was a sensational trial. It seemed to me, from what I read of it and researched, that apparently Kathy was very bright. Even though she didn't finish school, she was actually quite an intelligent woman, quite manipulative. So it seems to me that she possibly, created this whole scenario so she could take the heat off herself and blame her lover, who was apparently, not as intelligent, was a bit more seen as thuggish, I guess, in terms of the more, aggressive partner in the relationship on the surface. But it does seem like Kathy engineered it so she would get the sympathy and also be able to work with the police to lay all the blame on Gwendolyn Graham, who is never going to be eligible for parole, ever. Kathy Wood has been eligible for parole since about 2005, but it keeps getting knocked back. She can be released, though, in 2021, so she still will have some life to live when she gets released.
You say in the book that Wood insisted, again, very interesting, that Catherine Wood insisted on a polygraph, and, of course, Gwen Graham denied everything. How did the judge feel about, or what did the judge say about Catherine Wood's participation in this? That, again, was very interesting to me.
Well,
like in terms of her guilt as opposed to Gwen's guilt, that was he more in the idea that he would believe her rendition of the events?
Well, I know that he did describe them both as parasites. That was interesting. He said they fed off each other. It was some sort of sick relationship, where there's almost the worst combination of people that can get together, a bit like Fred and Rose West. They do these awful crimes. I think, I'm just trying to remember, he did praise, in a way, Kathy Wood for her part in bringing the crimes to the attention of the authorities. He actually said to them, without you, I'm sure this matter would never have been cleared up. And he was convinced that she showed remorse. And he said, you're a follower, not a leader. But definitely in my mind, from what I read, and I know from reading things that Laura Corfiel wrote after doing his lengthy investigation, and he really did a lot of stuff into this case, that he believed that Kathy was not innocent as she was portrayed. So I found that interesting, that in a few cases actually I've written about, the judges seem to almost be fooled by the defendants. And I think in this case it sounds like Kathy was portraying herself as the victim who was, forced into doing these things by her lover.
Yeah, it's interesting. Lowell Caulfield, he was on the program with his very, very shocking book, House of Secrets, and he's the author of Forever in 5 Days. And then you say that it was based on a poem, too, that, again, about the relationship between the two women. You'll be mine forever and 5 days. And so, and Lowell was adamant that Wood was the mastermind behind all this. So,
yeah, definitely. He thought that Kathy Wood, for whatever reason, she took her dislike of things, her anger, and she took it out on patients, and also ended up, ultimately punishing her lover, who they had split up, and Gwendolyn Graham had moved on and actually moved to Texas with a new girlfriend. So I think during the investigations, the police found out there was a lot of, just a hotbed of a lot of stuff, that nursing home, a lot of, stuff between the workers and gossip and grudges. So that they think that was what fed into it a bit too.
Yeah, it seems plausible to me, that explanation as well, that she was so intensely jealous that she would have, and wanted attention upon herself too. Very bizarre behavior, but very suspicious. Her motivations for coming forward, and then for her to be depicted as anything other than just as guilty was surprising to me. So,
yeah.
Now you have what you claim is the America's worst angel of death nurse serial killers, 1994, with potassium chloride being the instrument of death, and this is in Clinton, Indiana. And you have Orville Lynn Majors, as known by his friends, Lynn, and so tell us, this is back in 1984, and you talk about the story where he has a certain amount of credentials. He's working. Somebody tips off his employer, and they realize that he's got forged documents, and he's fired. And that's 1984. But in 1989, he's working as a practical nurse. And so tell us how that happens, and tell us about this Vermilion, this hospital in Vermilion, and tell us a little bit about the story with Orville Lynn Majors.
Yeah, this was, I found this one of the, probably, they were all awful and quite strange in their own way, but I found Orville Lynn Majors to be, one of the strangest cases I researched. So Lynn Majors, as he was known, he worked in nursing homes. He's seemingly quite good at his job, and he works in the ICU, and he likes to work alone, which this is another theme with these killers. They often work the night shift, and they often like to work alone for understandable reasons, so they can go on with whatever they're doing. And when there was an investigation into some deaths at the hospital he was working at, they actually discovered that there was a death in the ICU for the shift that he was on every 23 hours that he was working. And when he wasn't on his shift, that then stretched out to a patient died every, say, 500 hours. So there was a really big discrepancy of time there. So he started his nursing career in 1984, and he was working at a hospital in Missouri. I had to get my head around a lot of these counties, how it is in America. There are different counties within states and stuff. But he was working, and it was found that he didn't have the proper documentation to work in the role as a respiratory therapist. I think he was. We don't have those in Australia. It's some sort of health aid job. But then by 1989, he got his qualifications as a licensed practical nurse. And my understanding of that is a bit like an enrolled nurse. You can do a certain amount of things, but you can't do quite as much as a registered nurse. And he was away from work a lot. He got a lot of warnings about it. And he also, on his document, like his record, it actually has been labelled not for rehire by the administration of one of the hospitals that he worked at, right. And that was after he left in 1991. But amazingly, 2 years later, he was rehired again. And this is another theme throughout all the cases. Often it was really sloppy procedures in hospitals that let these things happen. They didn't check things. People weren't informed of certain things. So how he was brought to the attention of the facility that he was working at was that someone had sent an anonymous letter to the Indiana Department of Health, and these were forwarded to a local newspaper. And the letter actually said, would you want one of your loved ones to be a patient in that hospital with a death angel working? We need to stop this nurse, and I hope you will help us. And it basically also mentioned that Majors he had a history of being suspended, and that this person was concerned that the hospital was going to cover up the death so they didn't look so bad. But that is how it all started playing out. So that was in early 1995, he was suspended, and then his nursing license was suspended. And also the supervisor he had, the nurse supervisor, her name was a lady called Dawn Stirek, and she had done her own in-house investigation, so she just noticed there was a lot of deaths, and she thought she'd have a look at what was happening, and she discovered that by looking at the staff time cards, that between a period of 2 years, from 1993 to 1995, Lynn Majors, he was on duty for 130 of the 147 deaths in the ICU. And of the years prior to 1993 when this started, there had only been 31 patients who died. So that's another thing that you'll find when people read this book. You'll discover that often one staff member is always consistently present when a lot of people die. So that's what I found confounding as well, because it seems like the people who are trying to get the attention of hospital administration about things, they almost get fobbed off. But I don't know if that's an expression in Canada. They get dismissed, and people don't want to know about it, and they almost marginalise themselves because of their concern. And that's what happened to this lady Dawn too.
It was interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I wasn't going to say anything.
It was interesting too is that they had some eyewitness testimony too against Majors, in that there was a witness that said he had a syringe in the room right before that this person went into cardiac arrest, and that really not really a slam dunk trial. It really came down to battle of the experts, and the cardiologist gave testimony that he said it was consistent, that the illnesses were consistent with potassium chloride, and so that's how he ended up with 360 years, 60 years for each. 60 years for each crime, 60 times 6, 360 years for Majors, so with his potassium chloride. Now, Majors also, which interesting part of the story, some of these stories, you think, well, of course, there he goes, he's gone, and that's it, but he thinks, a pretty good shot at an appeal. So you were talking about some of the reasons why he thought he should be able to get another trial. So tell us a little bit about the jurors drinking beer and his appeal.
Yeah. This is quite strange, I found. So in 2002, his legal team launched an appeal, and the basis of that appeal wasn't that he was wrongly, didn't do the crimes. He basically alleged that the jury members had acted inappropriately during the 1999 trial. So in the appeal document, he mentioned things like one juror was seen to make an inappropriate facial expressions at a defense attorney, and that he also wanted a new trial because he said jurors had drunk beer during lunch breaks at the trial, and they drunk during deliberations, and the deliberations went for 3 days. And he also had a beef about the fact that he thought jurors were socialising with members of the state police at a picnic that had been organised by the Clay County Sheriff. Just to give listeners a bit of an idea, this was a massive trial in the state. It had a huge amount of publicity. It was very hard for them to find a jury that wouldn't have heard of the case, and it was a very lengthy process. So they were, I guess, the county sheriff, they were just trying to probably look after the jurors because they knew that they were, in for a pretty arduous time during this trial. But his appeals were thrown out. The judge upheld his conviction and said that the Clay County Sheriff, was a very experienced officer. He was well versed on the appropriate jury, the way that juries should be treated, and there was no real cause for Major's appeal. It was just I found them very strange reasons to launch an appeal.
Mm-hmm.
And a waste of probably time and taxpayers' money.
The good aspect of it is one bright aspect of it is that since that case, it did spark some some changes, and the way they have access to potassium chloride after that has been restricted, right? So there has been some changes, and so the ability to be able to get this, what's end up being a killer drug, has been restricted somewhat.
That's right. So within Indiana, I believe, and it's probably the same in other states, what Lynn Majors was able to do was somehow get access to undiluted potassium chloride, which obviously is a lot stronger and a lot more lethal than when it's pre-mixed. He was able to get his hands on vials of that, and then I'm assuming, inject it or fill the syringe straight from the bottle. I'm not really very medical. Funnily enough, my husband's a nurse and my mother's a nurse, so I've got a bit of interest in that. But I personally, am very clueless on medical matters. But what had changed now is that all potassium chloride things are pre-mixed in hospital pharmacies, and it's no longer freely available to ward staff. So you couldn't just go up to the fridge and go and get it out. It's now logged, and only certain people have access to it. And they do believe the prosecutors who worked on this case believe that this case actually probably put a bit of wind up a lot of other hospital administrators around America to tighten up their practices.
Sure, why not? It's bad. Death is bad for business, I would think. Now, as this book progresses, and there's, again, we've only touched on a few of these stories, but the last story we're going to just touch on, and again, I wanted to give examples of just the range of stories here, but really, it just escalates through the whole book in terms of the depravity and the shocking nature of some of these killers, and again, you just do a great job of having those little bits of information where an eyewitness sees somebody, again, being killed and really then ends up being in court testifying. Some of these people are nurses, fellow nurses that go to authorities, like in this case, and the authorities tell them, listen, mind your own business. And there's a few cases of that where people report and are told, listen, it's being taken care of, or listen, why don't you just mind your own business? So one of the more dramatic cases in this book is a nurse from Texas named Janine Jones, and she's suspected of 50 deaths. Again, I'd say we're ramping up the horror here. She's suspected of 50 deaths of children, ends up being, just talking about one particular sweet child, Chelsea McClellan. So tell us about Janine Jones, and this is in 1998, so the late 90s. So tell us a little bit about her, and then this Suzanne Maldonado, who's the one that ends up making a list of these suspicious deaths. So tell us a little bit about Janine Jones in Texas and in this Bexar County Medical Center.
Sure. So this is really a really interesting case because Janine Jones is in jail. She's now older and in not great health, but she actually is eligible to be released in 2018, which is unbelievable, but she actually will be able to. She became a nurse in 1977, and she started working at this Bexar County Medical Center Hospital in San Antonio, Texas. She was a very, straight-shooting, bossy woman. She had aspirations above her station, so she almost wanted to be in charge, and she would flit around, always involved in drama. She was someone that very much people either liked or they didn't like. Some doctors and nurses thought she was very confident, she was so dedicated to her patients, but there were other people who thought that she was just a troublemaker, she was disruptive, and she was an attention seeker. And she actually, many people who worked with her, and what came out during her trial was that she always sought out the sickest children to look after. She was very invested in being involved in this drama with the families of these poor little sick babies, and that she acted really like she ran the pediatric unit in that hospital. And there was always something had to work the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, and it was actually named the death shift. Peter Elkin in early 1980s wrote a really excellent long-form feature article for the Texas Monthly about this case, and then it became a book, and that's a really, really good read. If people can then want to know more, I've given a list of books that I recommend people read at the back of it to get more in depth about the cases. So every time, pretty much that Janine worked, she worked this shift, and colloquially known as shift amongst the hospital staff, because there was always an increase in the number of medical emergencies during that shift. There were babies who went into cardiac arrest, they had seizures, and they came close to death. able to, so Janine would go and alert people of these babies being sick and then they'd be revived, but many of them actually died. To thrive on the drama, she was very overdramatic. She was often found in the morgue. She'd want to take the babies down to the morgue and she'd be saying goodbye to them and cuddling them. And her behaviour actually aroused a lot of suspicion among co-workers. Basically, they thought that she was harming these babies. They really thought that. And you imagine that if nurses have these kind of suspicions, they're probably based on some sort of fact. And they thought that she was creating these medical emergencies so she could be the big shot and be a hero and be admired from the families. So there was this nurse. She was a register. She was higher trained than Janine. Her name was Susanna Maldonado, and so she began making a list of all the babies who were dying during that shift between 81 and 1982. She was a new nurse, so she was called. She hadn't been working for that long, and she worked the shift immediately after Janine Jones from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. And she just began to wonder, well, why are all these babies on this shift that Janine Jones worked? Why are they getting sicker? Why are they dying? Why aren't they getting better? And she actually took her concerns to their supervisor, called Pat Belko. But she was told in no uncertain terms, because she was a young nurse, they probably thought, oh, she's a bit keen. She was advised to stop playing amateur sleuth and leave it alone. We don't want to hear you, talking about this anymore. But then eventually, they were not able to ignore the fact that there were so many baby deaths and medical emergencies in the ICU, and they had to end up investigating themselves. And the in-house lawyers advised the doctors that they really needed to get rid of Janine Jones because she seemed to be the weak link. So no talk really of actually having her charged with anything, but they're like, you need to get her out of the hospital because these things are not good for our statistics. They're not good for, we don't want people questioning things. So that's another common theme about what happens in these cases. Often the hospital administration, it's almost like stuff in the Catholic Church. They just brush it under the carpet, remove the problem, but don't really do anything about it.
What's interesting, too, and as I was going to ask the question, but you brought up the issue, was that when they did their own internal investigation after telling this other Maldonado, be quiet, they said, these incidents could be considered coincidental, but they might be considered negligence, meaning they could be construed as we don't necessarily know them to be murder. They could be coincidences, but we might possibly be on the hook here. So I thought that was very, very cold and calculating. And the story that involves this too, the testimony of this woman of the one child that she was convicted of, and if I may, I'll just this is
sure.
One of the more dramatic parts of the book.
It's so sad. It's sad.
Yeah, she's at the hospital, and then she's at Dr. Holland, and this kid comes in with just a bad cold, basically. And so the woman says, at her suggestions, she says, Janine says, well, I'll take the child so you can have a little bit of privacy to be with the mother. And then the kid has a seizure. And then, remarkably, the mother believes that Janine had something to do with helping the child. Not only did the doctor save the child, so take it from there in terms of this incredible turn of events 2 or 3 times where she still trusted despite this, at least for the reader, this obvious horror.
Yeah, so this little girl, Chelsea McClellan, who is the little girl that Janine Jones was convicted of murdering, she was 15 months old. And so by this stage, Janine Jones had gone on to work. She'd left the hospital. She'd left of her own accord from that hospital, and she'd gone on to work with a doctor who was setting up a paediatric clinic. And in fact, this doctor had been warned by some people not to employ Janine Jones because of the cloud over her head. But she did. So Janine was working in this hospital, and little Chelsea McClellan, this was her regular clinic, and she'd been, it was the first time that the family had ever gone to this clinic. And she basically experienced a seizure and stopped breathing. So Chelsea was rushed to hospital. She recovered, but the doctors were baffled as to why she was sick. But the mother, Petty McClellan, she was really grateful to this Dr. Holland and Janine Jones because she was convinced that they'd saved her daughter's life. So the woman who actually caused this, the mother, was like, thank you so much for helping my daughter. So it didn't deter Mrs. McClellan from using the doctor's surgery again. So less than a month later, after this little girl had spent a week in hospital with, seizures that were, we now know, induced by Janine Jones giving her an injection of something, Janine Jones said to the mother, well, why don't we update your little girl's immunisations, or shots as they refer to them? And she did that. So the mother was actually holding her little girl, and the little girl was facing her mother. I mean, I've experienced this taking my own children for their immunisations. It's horrible, but very important. But almost immediately as an injection went into the little girl's thigh that Janine Jones gave, this thought that the little girl had trouble breathing. She was struggling to breathe. And this, to me, is just the most horrifying thing. The little girl was struggling to cry, and apparently, according to Petty McClellan, the mother, her little girl was trying to say mama and couldn't say it. And I just found that absolutely heart-wrenching. It was so horrible. So the mother could see what was happening right in front of her eyes. But during all this, Janine Jones actually gave another injection, and that's when she stopped breathing. And so immediately Janine Jones goes into drama mode. Right, we've got to get to the doctor, and little Chelsea died. But the reason why this case has come back into the news, because I saw some television interviews on YouTube with Petty McClellan speaking recently because of Janine Jones possibly could get parole. She was recounting what she saw that day, and she said that it was almost like Janine Jones was on a high, like she was excited by the drama when she was yelling that her little girl wasn't breathing, and she found that quite horrifying. So the reason why Janine Jones quite possibly can get parole is that there was, at the time of her imprisonment, there was a Texas law to ease overcrowding in prisons. So if you behaved, I guess you could get a reduction in your sentence. It was to ease overcrowding. So Janine Jones actually is eligible for release in 2018, but there is a very active group at the moment trying to work to find evidence of other cases so they can stop that happening. There's literally, they think hundreds of people, their children may have been killed by Janine Jones, and they believe that she was killed by Janine Jones, but for whatever reason, some were told to sign confidentiality agreements with the hospital. Maybe they were paid money for their loss. Some of them are prevented from talking, but the legal authorities are certainly really working with the families to try and find other evidence that Janine Jones killed children back then.
The other part of the story that's we just left out was that after, again, like this obvious murder attempt here, less than a month later, update her vaccination shots. So right in front of the mother, she injects her, then gives her another injection. Incredibly horrific. An ambulance is called. Mm-hmm. You can't write fiction this fantastic.
I know. Sorry, I forgot to mention this part. Oh. It's so crazy, this story.
Tell us about what happens in the ambulance.
Okay. So I was incorrect just before when I said, so they got the little girl's breathing stable, as they grabbed her from the mother to try and revive her. She'd stabilised a bit. The ambulance arrives, so they're taking her to hospital. But Janine Jones insists that she'll ride in the ambulance with the little girl, and the mother followed in her car. But during that ambulance ride, Janine Jones, I believe, or they know, gave the little girl another injection of the drug that she used to kill them, which was a muscle relaxant, and the little girl died in the ambulance, which is completely tragic because it's just horrifying. I found this Janine Jones case probably one of the worst, I think, that I'd written about, just in her. It's like a compulsion to kill almost. You just can't believe it, really. And you're right, you can't even make this stuff up.
Yeah, it's right out of the old Twilight Zone episodes where they, one time she gets close. Okay, they don't believe it. So then the next time she's again, but yet she's in the ambulance at the end. So that's really like just something out of Twilight Zone that no one notices. No one realizes, no one realizes that this beast has just the capacity to kill this kid right in front of her mother, and yet still
and
wants
the way
to
they
manipulate,
the way they manipulate their victims to be caring, and the poor victims think, well, she's obviously really dedicated. She's a great nurse. She really cares about my child. They're manipulated, so that would be even worse.
Yeah, this is I guess keeping in with the profile of a serial killer, where they'll pick upon the vulnerable to be their victims. Mm-hmm. These people do exactly the same, whether it be a child, a sick child, a child visiting a hospital, an elderly patient in a nursery home, old ladies that are immobile and they're setting fires to distract from the opiates that you're stealing. These hospitals are just trying to cover their own investors and their own, getting advice from their lawyer, which really has nothing to do with the victims that could be mounting. They have some of these rates of death, where they have some of these suspected nurses and doctors on shift that can defy any other kind of explanation. And you've included it all in this incredible Angels of Death. You've got a chapter on Harold Shipman and Michael Zwango. This is a really comprehensive, scare you next time you want to go to the hospital type book. I congratulate you on this.
Thanks for featuring it. It was something I was really interested in, and the more I researched, the more I discovered, and it's actually quite frightening how easy it was for a lot of these people to kill unnoticed for a long time, and because of, I guess, behind the respectability of the profession, but also it's good to note as well, this is definitely not the norm. I don't want to demonise really hardworking nurses and doctors, but certainly there are, you can't dispute it, there are cases of healthcare professionals who do kill people.
It's very interesting that the system itself seems to not have much of a safeguard for these rogue-type nurses and doctors, these killers, in terms of once one institution recognizes that there's something amiss, that they wouldn't ethically pass on that information to another hospital, or the situation is so dire in terms of these people being needed that it sets up this incredible situation where you don't really check out credentials. To me, that's the most amazing part of this book, I think.
That's right. I think when I was reading and writing about Charles Cullen, certainly he was able to move between a lot of hospitals. He left or was told to leave, but people weren't checking references. I think that's another thing. It calls to question about the pressures that health facilities and healthcare professionals are under. Is it because they're so overworked, or that they don't properly check people, or is it hard to get nurses to work in certain areas? It just seems that there were many times, particularly with Charles Cullen, Harold Shipman, things like that, where they could have been caught and they weren't. And it just kind of kept going on. I mean, eventually they were caught, but in between they were able to kill a lot more people.
Now, in this book, you have cases from all over the world, and one of the cases we didn't get to talk about, but is included in your book, another fascinating duo of killers, is this Lane's Death Angels from Austria, and this is like late 1980s, 89. What I was going to ask is that in your research, did you find that this is again, it's not a unique phenomena, unique to America, but was it more prevalent in America, or is it just, in terms of your research, could you conclusively say that this is just an issue that occurs everywhere?
Well, I think there were more American cases, definitely, but it happened in Europe. There were other cases, actually, I could have written about, but I just, you know what it's like working to a deadline. There's only so much you can do. I read of cases in Latin America. I know there's one at the moment. There's a nurse in Italy who's on trial or has been charged with murders. It certainly did seem to be more prevalent in America, but there were actually quite a few cases in Britain and in Europe. Australia, not so much, and there are some cases, but because they're under appeal or they're currently being dealt with in court, I obviously couldn't write about them. As we discussed last time I spoke to you, the laws in Australia around what you can and can't report are very strict. No, it's not like America where you basically can interview anyone and, you know, anyone can speculate about what they think. There are really, really strict rules about court reporting. So, I couldn't write about those. But certainly I think Britain probably, and America, that was most prevalent, or they were the most kind of cases.
Well, I want to just, again, thank you for this book, Angels of Death, a fascinating collection of stories that will scare you half to death anyway, reading about this. And so I want to thank you very much. It's a very interesting new phenomena, I think. I mean, almost new, but a more recent phenomena. Again, another variant of the serial killer. And again, like very many of the other serial killers, they blend into society so that they are just the person next door, the caregiver, the neighbor, the sweet nurse, or the caring doctor. So it's even more horrifying when you think about that, I think. So
definitely I think that is the shock value of it, that they seem to be so normal and respected. Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Emily, for coming on and talking to us from Melbourne, Australia. Thank you very much for this, and I hope to talk to you again soon. I know you're a very prolific writer, so I'm sure we'll be talking to you again soon with another spine-tingling collection of true crime stories. So thank you very much for this, Emily, and you have a great evening.
Thanks, Dan.
Good night.
Good night.